In October 2001, a bizarre reported alien abduction took place in Queensland, Australia. The experience of Amy Rylance became one of the most intriguing close encounter cases of the 21st century. Added to this, the occurrence was largely reviewed, examined and investigated by two respected UFO researchers almost immediately afterwards. On the evening of Thursday, October 4th, in the town of Gundiah, Keith Rylance, his wife Amy and their business partner, Petra Heller, was staying in a temporary caravan annex home on a property they were developing as the Whispering Winds Winery. Just after 9:30 p.m, with Keith already asleep in the main caravan bedroom and Petra in her room in the annex, Amy watched television in the lounge area. While a storm gathered outside, she fell asleep on the sofa. Petra later reported that she awoke at around 11:15 p.m. and walked into the lounge where she would witness the extraordinary events. Directly ahead of her, entering through an open window, was a, quote, rectangular beam of light, inside of which Amy lay, still in her sleeping position. Several objects from the nearby coffee table also floated within this mysterious beam of light. Scanning the beam for its source outside, Petra saw the light extending back towards a disc-shaped object hovering at tree level close by. She then fainted, overwhelmed by fear. Although out for perhaps only minutes, when Petra regained consciousness, she immediately screamed as loud as she could, waking Keith and then trying to explain what she had seen. Observing a tear in the screen at the open window and the scattered belongings from the coffee table on the floor immediately below it, Keith began a frantic search for Amy around the property. She was nowhere to be found. Even after hearing a calmer account from Petra, Keith refused to believe her version of events, again venturing outside to locate Amy. Finally, at around 11:40 p.m, he telephoned the TRO Police Department, after which at about 1 a.m, Constable Robert Maragna and another officer arrived at the Whispering Winds Winery. By then, and with no reason to doubt Petra's credibility, Keith had begun to accept her account of the bizarre incident. The police who attended were bemused when Keith and Petra claimed in all seriousness that a spaceship had abducted Amy from the caravan as she slept. Sergeant John Bosnack soon also arrived, and the three officers conducted an extensive search of the property and its surrounds. They also found no sign of Amy, taking samples from around the torn screen and noting evidence of exposure to extreme heat of a flowering bush on the left side of the window. These initial investigations saw the opening of a missing person case, until Keith took a phone call from a woman in the town of Mackay, nearly 500 miles to the north and an 8-hour drive from Gundiah. She claimed to have found a young woman in a confused and dehydrated state at a petrol station and had taken the woman to Mackay Hospital. After discovering her identity, she had made contact to inform Keith that his wife was safe. Overwhelmed with questions as to how Amy had travelled so far away, just 90 minutes after going missing, Keith passed the phone to Maragna. The police's missing person investigation became a joint Gundiah-Mackay matter. After a medical assessment at the Mackay Hospital, Amy Rylance was interviewed by the police, revealing fascinating details that found their way onto the official record. She claimed to recall that after laying on the sofa and falling asleep, her next memory was of waking on top of a bench in a strange rectangular room. An illuminated glow was all around her, although she couldn't detect the source of the light. Quickly looking around, she found herself alone, but called out to hopefully elicit a response. A, quote, male voice sounded from nowhere, telling her to stay calm and that no harm would come to her. Soon there appeared an opening in the wall and a figure entered. Around 6 foot tall, the seemingly male being wore a one-piece bodysuit covering from head to toe. A black mask with holes for eyes, nose and mouth covered his face, and he again told her to remain calm, revealing himself as the owner of the previous voice. Amy sensed that she had been unconscious for a considerable length of time when her strange host said that they were returning her to, quote, a place not far from where they had taken her. Her next clear memory was lying back on the bench and drifting back into sleep, but when she awoke, she was lying on cold ground with trees above and a surrounding smell of the ocean. Disorientated, she got up and stumbled through bushland until reaching the welcome site of the petrol station. As she walked into its service area, staff immediately noticed something wrong and went to her assistance. Although not making much sense, she accepted water and slowly began to feel better. Strangely, she couldn't remember her name or where she lived, which is when the woman who had later contacted Keith spoke with Amy and took her to the nearest hospital. When Amy gave her statement to Mackay police, she would disclose that although she had never had this experience before, as a young child she had witnessed a large UFO surrounded by smaller objects. Amy also signed agreements that enabled prosecution if any of her statements were false. Petra and Keith, now driving, were still a long distance from Mackay, so police booked Amy into a motel for the night. When they arrived on the afternoon of October 5th, the three went over what had happened and attempted to construct a timeline together based on their memories of the evening. They also captured images of strange triangular arrangements on Amy's inner right thigh and each of her heels. Amy attributed the marks to tests the aliens had conducted on her, while however describing the incident to media reporters as a good experience. She had dyed her hair blonde just days earlier, but suddenly found significant hair regrowth, showing her natural darker colour. Some believe this suggests that what were just a few hours on Earth was much longer for Amy, wherever she was. Accordingly, running her hand over her legs, which she regularly shaved, they felt like she hadn't done this for several days. At the motel, Amy, Keith and Petra immediately began researching UFOs and alien abduction, eventually finding contact details for Diane Harrison at the Australian UFO Research Network. Harrison also involved fellow researcher and investigator Bill Chalker, who had a special interest in solid light phenomena. The investigators began a journey to Mackay, on the way visiting the Whispering Winds winery to examine the site of the incident. Arriving late at the Rylance property, they arranged to stay in the caravan annex overnight. From there, their findings raised more questions than they answered. While staying at Whispering Winds, they noticed the family dog, who was being fed by a neighbour, was often jumping up at the window with the broken screen through which Amy had floated. A skeptic could say this may explain the apparent damage to the screen. When the UFO investigators arrived in Mackay, they were unable to speak personally with Keith, Amy and Petra as arranged. They discovered the three had checked out only that morning, and their repeated voicemail messages went unanswered. Keith finally phoned Harrison and Chalker when, after apologising, he claimed they had been forced to move to a secret location after alleged Men in Black harassment. He stated that their car had been followed for days by a heavy-duty dark brown four-wheel drive. He undertook to contact the investigators several days later, but never disclosed their location or provided new information. Although the case remains officially open, the whereabouts of Keith and Amy Rylance and Petra Heller are unknown. Rumours emerged that all three now reside somewhere in the north of England. Speculation has been wide-ranging that the incident was a simple hoax, or that the trio had been intimidated into seclusion and anonymity, therefore feeling the need to flee the country and basically go into hiding. The verdict of the investigators was that while some aspects of the witness accounts, such as Amy's strange physical manifestations, lend some credibility, their abrupt and unexplained disappearance leaves the truth unconfirmed. Their case was deemed, at this stage, inconclusive. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like. It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey.
And now we have a bonus story for you. The Skirrid Inn. The Skirrid Inn is approximately 6 kilometres north of Abergavenny, Monmouthshire in southeast Wales. It is located on an old coaching road, and for centuries the pub served many travellers. The Skirrid Inn is currently a popular public house, but it has a sinister past. One visitor who experienced a terrifying episode at the Skirrid Inn was a man by the name of Simon Curwood. One day Simon and his wife decided they wanted to stay somewhere and thought they would go to the inn because they liked old buildings. As Simon sat down with his drink, and as he was about to lift the glass to his mouth, he felt an incredible pain in his stomach that was followed by visions and flashbacks. He found himself hanging and could see his feet below him kicking back and forth. He knew that it wasn't his body, but at the same time could see bloody hands. He felt he had either been temporarily possessed or was experiencing something terrible that had happened in the past, or maybe he was experiencing a past life. Simon found that he wasn't alone, as numerous staff and visitors to the pub had complained of similar experiences. One afternoon, around 3 p.m, Kelly Parry was laying out some cutlery. As she was placing the knives and forks on the table, she heard what sounded like a roar in her ear, as if someone was standing close to her, which she found terrifying. After that incident, she didn't like working there on her own anymore, especially at night when it was dark. Another visitor to the inn was a woman by the name of Vicky Cartledge, who was sitting downstairs by the main fireplace with some friends. As they all sat around laughing, joking and talking, Vicky suddenly felt a very clear presence standing just behind her right shoulder. She sensed it was a woman, and at one stage actually heard her say her name, which was Fanny Price. This unnerved her and she became very scared. After a period of time, other women came forward on a regular basis with tales of a frightening female presence that would strike without warning. One guest reported that while she was staying at the inn and was laying in the bath, something had grabbed hold of her and was holding her under. She became so distressed and hysterical and immediately left. She had barely dried herself and her hair was still wet as she screamed to the landlord, Jeff Fiddler, "She's trying to hold me down. She's trying to hold me down." At the time, the landlady, Heather Grant, had become very concerned and she went looking for answers as to why this was happening. One afternoon, a couple came in saying they were trying to trace their family tree and had heard that a man called Henry Price was the landlord of the inn around the mid-18th century and had a death certificate of his wife, aged 32, who had died of consumption, or what is now commonly known as tuberculosis, and her name was Fanny. Could it be that the woman that was haunting the inn was Fanny Price, and the former landlady was purposely scaring staff and visitors away from her old pub? Maybe after all the years, she's not accepted her death and still believes she owned the inn. After further research, they found that the inn had had a checkered past, where as well as an inn, it had also served as a courthouse, where local villains were both sentenced and hanged from a beam in the inn, no doubt leaving a lot of negative energy. What was most frightening was that nobody knew where or when Fanny Price was going to appear next. The Cavendish Inn. In November 1988, Laura Collins was staying at the Cavendish Inn in Harrogate, North Yorkshire, where one evening she was to experience something so terrifying she was initially too frightened to tell anyone about it for fear of being ridiculed. Laura and a work colleague had driven to the hotel, which was approximately 1.5 hours from her work, because the following morning she was to have a typing exam. Although Laura and the other woman were not close friends, they did know each other from work. They arrived at the Cavendish Hotel about 7:30 p.m, and after completing the usual formalities, had dropped their bags off in their respective rooms and went downstairs to have dinner. Although the hotel was very old, his rooms were fairly modern, with a double bed, television and ensuite bathroom. As there was not much else to do around the small town, after dinner they each went to their separate hotel rooms to settle in for an early night. Laura initially watched some television before relaxing in the bath, and then watched some TV before jumping into bed and quickly drifted off to sleep. Sometime during the night, Laura was suddenly awoken as she felt the bed dip next to her. She later claimed that it felt as if someone had suddenly sat down. At this stage, she had not turned on the light, and with her eyes still closed, she put her hand out and felt a distinct hollow in her bed. The feeling of the hollow startled her awake, where she suddenly sat up straight and saw a solid-looking man sitting at the end of her bed and facing away from her as if he had just got up. The man was wearing red and white striped pyjamas and was bending over to put on his bedroom slippers. To describe the man's physical appearance as looking old and balding, with grey hair around his ears and the back of his head. He was short in stature, but she never saw his face the whole time he had his back to her. The strangest thing was that, as he was carrying out this morning ritual, he was totally oblivious of Laura staring at him in the bed next to him. However, Laura was not sitting in the bed casually observing the old man, as she was absolutely terrified and was holding back a loud scream. But she was too scared to let out any sort of utterance, in case he turned around and suddenly noticed her sitting there. But there was no doubt in Laura's mind that this man was real, as he looked solid. Before she could make any further decisions of what to do next, the man then stood up, walked towards the window, and promptly vanished into thin air. At that point, Laura had still not screamed, but for the rest of the night she could not get back to sleep, and sat there with the light on. Strangely though, the following day, driving back to work with a work colleague, and without any comments by Laura, her colleague said that the previous night, as they were having dinner together, she had wanted to tell her about a friend of hers who had had a nasty experience in the very room that Laura had stayed in, but decided not to tell her for fear of upsetting her. For some unusual reasons, Laura had still kept quiet about her experience, but did ask her colleague the name of the person who had had the nasty experience in her room. She found out that her name was Anne Hughes, and she had stayed in the same room 3 weeks earlier for the same reason as Laura having a typing exam the following day. Anne claimed she'd been asleep and was suddenly awoken by a loud bang. She had found that her bedside lamp was now lying at the foot of her bed and was a considerable distance from where it had originally stood next to her bed. She said that there was no way she could have knocked over the lamp in her sleep, so that it landed so far from her bed. Anne was also said that as she was sitting staring at the lamp, she felt the presence of someone sitting in the bed next to her. But unlike Laura, she had no visual sighting of an old man or anybody else. However, her unusual experience did not end there, when she noticed that her thumb was badly swollen, and when she went to the local hospital to have it checked out, they told her it looked like bite marks. She was advised to have a tetanus injection, but was baffled as to how something could have bitten her thumb so badly whilst she was asleep in bed.